You've tuned in to Armchair Expat, a series to help you navigate the many unique challenges of moving abroad. Join me, Shannon Acton, host, curator, and chief bargain huntress at Bargain Homes Abroad, as I interview experts across the globe who offer tips and practical advice as you plan your next move in life. Hey folks, welcome back for the second installment of Armchair Expat. Today I'm talking to Jessica Drucker, one of my favorite people on Instagram. You may have seen me interviewed over on her stories and Instagram TV a couple of weeks ago. And now I'm returning the favor, although I did this interview a little bit ago. I'm not going to lie. I'm just now getting around to publishing it. But I think you're going to like it. I sourced a lot of the questions from you back in November about what you wanted to know about moving abroad. So she addresses all those questions quite handily. Jessica is, besides being one of my favorite Instagram accounts and a friend now that we've met, she is a multiple time expat. She is an author of the book, How to Move Abroad and Why It's the Best Thing You Do, which I highly recommend. She has her own podcast, which is called Adventure Calls. She has a full-time job, she has a partner, and she has a son. She's got a busy life, and so I'm so grateful that she took some time to help us. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Jessica Drucker. So welcome. Do you want to give us a little bit of your background and story and why you decided to be an expat and travel so much in the world?
Yeah, I will try to keep this short because that's very, very long. I will say this, first of all, hi, thank you so much for having me. This is great. I mean, I'm obsessed with your account, your Instagram, as you know, just like your many thousands of followers. I think you give us the chance to dream and find us what we're actually looking for. So I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you.
So you say, like multi-passionate because I do have all these different things going on, but like really my passion is this. Like I did live abroad for those 10 years and everyone, both during that time, especially then after that, when I became like nomadic and it seems like so romantic and it seemed like so something that they couldn't do. People would always say to me like, oh my God, I wish I could do this. I wish I could live abroad. I wish I could travel. And like everything I do now is focused on the fact that it is 100% tangible for anyone to do that if that is what you're. And so everything I do really focuses on just like reducing barriers or helping you jump over them to get you to do that thing. What I realize is like people create the barriers in their minds for all these reasons why they can't move abroad or can't travel. I don't have enough money. I have kids. I have a family. I'm old. I'm sick. I'm too young. I don't have enough, whatever. And like my job, like however I can do it, is to find ways around those for you, because on the road and abroad, I met people from every background, every health situation, every age range, every financial range. And I never met a trust fund baby. Just going to say you do not have to be rich to do this. And so, yeah, so that's kind of like what I focus on. And I just, for me, I did start living abroad as a student. I did this study abroad thing. I lived in Costa Rica as a study abroad student. And I think a lot of people get started that way. And like, I would love to convince every high school student to think about studying abroad in college, life-changing. But while I was there, I just couldn't believe that like this was going on in the world all the time. And I was in the cornfields of Illinois at the University of Illinois, just like getting a degree. It drove me crazy to think that the world was out there. So I decided to move to Guatemala after that. I lived there for 2 years, moved to Germany for 3 years. And I was so young and dumb at that time. I didn't even understand what it meant that I lived in the former East Germany. I didn't even really know about like communism. I was just really, but the world taught me while I was there, obviously, and kind of some embarrassing moments there. But the more I learned about just like the world, basically, I wanted to know more and more. I ended up going to England to get a master's degree in media and culture studies. And then I lived in London after that for 3 years. So yeah, so that's the decade. And then I basically realized I was working essentially remotely before, we all shifted to this. This was in 2010. And I realized I didn't have to be paying London rent to be earning London, like British pounds. And so I thought I could be back in Guatemala with my 300 a month rent. And then I just started dreaming about becoming a nomad. And then I did that for 4 years. So
Wow.
that's
Good
the
for you.
story. Thank you.
Awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I had some of our audience submit questions about moving abroad because I have my own questions, but I wanted to source it. So there was a great response. So I'm going to try and get to as many as we can in our given time. But I guess we start with number one. What are the first steps that people should be thinking about as they're looking to move abroad?
Yeah. It can seem super overwhelming. And I am almost thankful I started this when in 1999, like before like the internet happened the way that it is now, because there weren't so many answers, like different answers to this question. It can be so confusing out there. So the first thing I would encourage people to do is first, you've got to find your why, then you can figure out your where, and then you can find your team. So that's kind of how I break it down. And when I say find your why, it can sound kind of woo-woo, but like just know exactly what it is you're either trying to escape or trying to run to. Because if you just decide like I want to live on a beach, why? Are you sure? Because life on a beach can be great, but there's some downsides. It really depends on where you move. So you have to kind of know, are you escaping the rat race? Do you want to slow down your life? Because there are different locations for different types of like lifestyles. So you got to kind of know like what it is that you're either running from or running to. Some people are moving abroad for their career. They want to better their career, or they're scared that moving abroad will mess up their career, but their career is still very important to them. So if your why or your fear around your why is like messing up your career, then you have to focus on, okay, where can I go but kind of maintain my career? So there's really just being really honest about why you want to move abroad is number one. And then you find you have to really research the different countries that can help you like have this dream that you want. And so I always use Costa Rica as an example, because like you might think, okay, I want to live on a beach. But if you move to Costa Rica and you live on a beach, like you have to be okay with rainy season. And when it rains, I mean, it pours. You have to be okay with like not just cockroaches, but they have cucarachones, which are like, very big, spiders, snakes that live in trees. You have to be okay with like everything that comes with it, or you won't find like the happiness that I think you're looking for. So you have to kind of start with being really honest, and please make sure that you're not just running away, because the thing I also learned myself is that you can't escape yourself no matter where you go. And so if you are running away from something, you're going to end up with it everywhere you go. So regardless of all of that, if you understand exactly what you're looking for, the real steps are you can there are actually many of us out there who, I have a book obviously called How to Move Abroad and Why It's the Best Thing to Do. You can start there. It's been very inexpensive risk to take. But there are so many Facebook groups that you can join. They devolve into really negative comments sometimes, like all internet things do. But if you think you want to move to Costa Rica or to Portugal, and you can't decide, and that's kind of what's on your list, join both the expats in Costa Rica and the expats in Portugal Facebook groups. Start asking questions. Yeah. I always say this, but like almost 9 million Americans live abroad right now. So they're in these groups, they answer questions. So I would say, honestly, start reaching out in Facebook groups and start asking as many questions as you can, or just maybe don't re-ask questions that everyone asks every time they join the group, but search inside of those groups to find yourself some answers. And that's really the third part of what I'm talking about. Find your team. So there are so many people that have gone before you, and they're out there. There's vloggers, bloggers, Instagrammers, authors, people that you can learn from, and they are all there. So after you kind of know, or you hone in on where you want to go, start finding experts in your field and start putting together information that they give you. And then from there, you can, if you need more help, you can obviously hire coaches, hire relocation services, and then start paying people to help you really figure things out. You also don't have to pay anyone.
Right. Well, that's great advice. Thank you very much. One of the big questions that came up were visas. How does that work? Like, where can I go? Like, I'm an American, I'm a Canadian, and for the record, like most of the audience is North American. the vast majority. So when we're speaking to, and we're both in the United States, so when we're speaking to visas and that kind of thing, we're typically talking about, US citizens, right? But some of it can probably be loosely translated to either Canada or some other countries as well. But let's just kind of start with, how do visas work? What kind of visas are there? I know it's going to vary by country, but tell me a little bit about what
Oh, yeah. I mean, so visas are the yucky part. I'm going to put this out there right now. This is the part that this is where the barriers can feel the highest. So I'll be really honest about that. But I will also tell you that when I look back on 15 years abroad, I never think about the fact that I had to go get a visa at a German embassy and didn't understand a word of what someone was saying to me, right? Like, I don't think about the hard part now, but it's yucky. So, okay, which is not the professional term. It's my term. So basically it's like this. So you can be looking for a residency opportunity. And so in order to be able to reside in a country, you need to extend beyond the tourist visa. So you don't think about it when you travel, but you always get a tourist visa when you land somewhere. You cannot earn money on a tourist visa, technically, in that country. So now you have to look at ways to get residency. And most often that's a work visa. But that can feel also really scary because you have to get a job in order to get a work visa. What happens is there's a catch-22 that exists there. And this is where people can start to feel very frustrated. Do you apply for jobs from abroad, get a work visa and go? Do you go as a tourist, network, and look for a job when you're there? And the answer is yes to both. It really just depends. So some countries are okay with you being in the country on a tourist visa, getting a job, and then applying for a visa. Other countries say in order to apply for this work visa that you need, you have to be outside of the country. That really varies by country, and there's no general rule about it. But a work visa is one way to get residency in a country, and you might get that visa for a year, or they might have a 2-year work visa. But when you live abroad, you are always dealing with extending your visa. You are always, like, every year or every 2 years until you get to a certain point when you can apply for a longer term residency visa. And those have different names in different countries. Mm-hmm. You're kind of always reapplying for that process, or you're always kind of going through the process of reapplying. So there's the work visa. There are, depending on where you are in your life and or whether or not you run your own business, there are other types of visas nowadays that are super convenient. There are digital nomad visas. So lots of countries have figured out that they could get you to spend money in their country and earn money in another country. And that's really smart. The US has not caught up on this at all. We make immigration very difficult here. Thailand has a digital nomad visa and an e-residency visa. Estonia, not many people think about it, but they actually are the most digitized country in the world, I think. They're the most online country, and they have a digital nomad visa. You're still in Europe. You get all the quaintness and beauty of Europe. You're within the Schengen visa zone, meaning you can live in Estonia but travel anywhere you want within like the EU boundaries, the Schengen zone, really. So Estonia. And there are other countries that are, so right now during the pandemic, Bermuda, Barbados, these countries have opened up these sort of welcome stamps or work remotely from our country visas that are actually awesome. It's like a great thing that happened during COVID. But essentially, because we're all working remote, they want you to come work on the beach. They're selling you the dream. And you fill out, your paperwork, and you can go live and work there for at least a year. So that's opening up quite a bit. So then there are, Spain, for example, has something called a non-lucrative visa. It's kind of the same thing as a digital nomad visa. And what this is as long as you're earning, I think it's 2,500 euros a month from another country. So let's say from the US, you have a business, dividends, whatever it is, you just have to show that you're making a certain amount of income a month. You can live in Spain and get this residency visa. What's awesome about that, you don't have to get a job there. But for example, if you have a family, your kids can go to public school. So you have to buy private healthcare, which I'm sure we'll get into, but your kids can go to school. You can really be a resident of Spain without worrying about getting a job, which is awesome, because getting a job in Spain, first of all, really hard. Their economy is not doing very well. It's just very hard to actually get a work visa in Spain. The last thing, which is probably the most interesting for your audience, are the golden visas. If you have the cash, you can buy residency. And essentially you do that through real estate. So Spain, Portugal, you need to invest 500,000 euros in a property, and you get just residency, not like a temporary visa. You get like residency to live in the country because you've bought property. Malta is the cheapest golden visa in Europe. I think it's about 130,000 euros you have to invest, but then you're living in Malta, so you have to want to live on an island.
Right.
And other countries like Singapore, Malaysia, there are other countries that have golden visas as well. And you can look that up. That's a term that people use. So you basically buy your way into residency, bypassing all of the more difficult things around getting a work visa. So
cool.
There you
go. I
go.
know you spent time in Germany, and I did see that Germany has like what they call is it a freelance visa, or what is their?
Totally forgot that one. Totally. Yeah. So Germany's interesting because they do have this freelance visa. And you basically, so with Germany, what you need to do is show that there are German companies who have interest in hiring you for your work. So say you're a designer, you have to show, they don't have to hire you. You just have to show that three companies are interested in hiring you for your services. There is also an artist visa. You can only apply for that if you live in Berlin. But what's awesome is if you're like any type of artist and you're a broke, poor artist, or you had a career and now you just want to paint and you've been dreaming of doing that your whole life, you can figure out ways to apply for this artist visa as long as you're like living in the Berlin area. As far as I understand, it's only in Berlin. Okay. It's like a subsection of this freelancer visa.
Okay. Okay. Awesome. And I think France has a somewhat similar version of that, but I don't know.
Might. I don't actually know. And then I just want to put this out there, whether or not you ever considered being a teacher, one of the easiest ways to get that work visa is to become an English teacher. I know it might not be something that you were thinking about, but you could work, say, 20 hours a week being an English teacher. It depends on what the minimum is, but you could get a job just because you're a native speaker of English in many countries around the world. It might not be your dream, but I always talk about what's your anchor and what's your variable. So what I mean is, do you have to live in France? Is it your dream? Will you die if you don't live in France for at least a couple years of your life? Okay, so France is then your anchor. That's the unmovable thing. So how are you going to do it? Because France isn't necessarily the easiest country to move to. Well, could you get a job teaching English? Could you go back to university? Do you have money to buy into their golden visa residency program? So those are your variables, right? But your variable might be something else. But if you really want to move to a country, the only way you can do it is teaching English. I mean, it's not the most difficult job. It's also not the most, romantic version of your expat self, perhaps, but it is one of the easiest ways to get an actual work visa abroad. And the reason is you can do something that the locals can't do because you're a native speaker of English. So you can do that. You can speak English better than the locals. Yeah. That's why. Yeah.
What are the other kind of pre-qualifications in order to teach English and what are the kinds of teaching jobs that are let's talk Europe for instance.
Yeah, Europe is fine. So different. In some countries, you really, some countries and also some language schools within the country, you really just have to have usually a bachelor's degree in literally anything and be a native speaker. That's it. So for example, in Germany, when I moved there, I got a job right away at Berlitz, which is an international language school. Their policy is to only hire native speakers. So they work to get you the visa because they're not going to find as many native English speakers in Germany, right? So they get you the visa. And then at the same time, I also worked at a business college as an English teacher. I taught English for business. But that school required me not only to have a BA, and I even had a BA in language teaching because my bachelor's is in the teaching of Spanish. I still had to get a TEFL, which is Teaching English as a Foreign Language certificate. So I would say that if you're considering at all teaching English, just get a TEFL now. You can do most of the work online. I mean, nowadays everything's online right now. Yeah. But I went through a company called I2I, which is I, the letter TOI. It's like, I forget how many hours of online work in online instruction and practice. It's really not that hard.
Mhm.
And then with your TEFL certificate, you can apply for many jobs. You do usually have to have a bachelor's degree.
Okay. And do
Yeah.
those expire, or just once you're certified, it kind of?
I don't know. That's a good question. I actually have no idea if they ever really expire. I feel like once you have one and then you also have teaching experience in the country, it doesn't really matter.
Right. Right.
Um, but I don't actually know if they expire.
So we started talking about jobs. Let's explore that a little bit about kind of, well, let's use your personal experience, like how you went to Germany and you found a job once you were there. Like, how did that
Yeah.
whole process work? How did the networking go? How did the application process go? How does that work?
Yeah, it's really different depending on who you are and where you're at in life, right? So for me, I was like a fly by the seat of my pants kind of girl at that time. I was like 20, how old was I? Like 23 or something. Like, I didn't know anything. I just went. But to my defense, I just went, and within 2 months, I had two full-time jobs. I worked 70 hours a week when I lived in Germany. So yeah, I couldn't help it. I just had so much work, and I didn't, I lived in, like I said, the former East Germany. So there weren't as many, like, Americans were all going to like Frankfurt, Munich, Berlin, which is East, but still. But I lived in a city where people really didn't end up. So I just had so much work, plus private classes too. I mean, I just had so much work. So like I was saying, I really do advise that unless it's actually impossible, meaning the visa restrictions don't allow it, I would recommend having 2 months worth of savings. If you know you want to move to a country, just go on your tourist visa and then you can start networking. Find fellow expats. There are expat groups. There are different gatherings that you can, I mean, again, depending on your sort of age and what you're into, there are different types of groups that you can find, but there's always expats, and you can start asking questions, networking. If we can ever see each other in person again, maybe there's like drinking and networking, but whenever that happens. And then that's how you can find your connections to jobs that way. You can apply for jobs online before you go. Here's the thing about that though. If you've worked in the corporate world at all and you've ever, hired someone, would you ever hire someone from France for a job in the US, but they live in France? No, like, thanks for your application. That's sweet. But like, Johnny lives in the city, so we're not going to hire you. Like unless they're really looking for an American for some reason, they're probably not going to hire you to move abroad. It could be an option, but it's rare. When it comes to teaching, though, there's the Japan exchange teaching program for Japan, and there are other similar like teaching exchange type programs that will hire you while you're still in your own country. But I say fly there, figure it out once you get there, network, ask people. There are so many groups for you to ask in online and in person. The other option is to work for a company that does expat transfer. So if you work for like a larger corporation and then you sort of work your way into getting a position abroad, becoming a corporate expat is also an option. Mm-hmm. But also a lot of the time, the entrepreneurs are going to be able to find easier ways to move abroad nowadays, because there are those digital nomad visas, there are those non-lucrative visas. So, you could also go the route of just starting your own thing. Uh-huh. Life is a little bit cheaper, unless you're going to like purchase a home and you have 3 kids, then this is obviously a huge risk for you. But life can be a little bit cheaper in Europe in certain ways, even if you have to pay for your own health insurance, which I'm sure you're going to ask me. Rent is cheaper. Move somewhere that's not so expensive, but rent is cheaper. You're never going to be hit with $1 million healthcare bill. You can take a little bit of a bigger risk and make 2,000 or 3,000 euros a month as an entrepreneur, and live off of that. So that's another option that's kind of new with these great new visas that are happening. So just something else to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great advice. So speaking of renting versus buying, talk to me about, let's first talk about the rental process. And what that looks like. What are the, well, let's just go from there. What is it?
Yeah, it can be, so Europe is a different animal to other places. So we'll just kind of focus on Europe really quick. So again, if you're going to go, like I said, for the first 2 months, and just sort of trying to figure things out, get yourself something familiar. And what I mean is, do not do a long-term rental before you arrive. Get an Airbnb or Verbo or whatever it is. But just do it like you're on an extended vacation and get an Airbnb first while you figure things out. And in Europe, you probably are not going to get a long-term contract anyway, because it gets complicated. When you actually, what you'll find about moving abroad, and this is the yucky part, okay, is that everything's a catch-22. Everything is like, well, you can't get and every country's different. You can't get a job until you have a bill where we can see your address, but you can't get an apartment until you have a job. So a lot of this is this, you live in this ambiguous state, which is very good for building your life skills. And I highly recommend it to anyone, because it's actually very, in terms of personal development, you could throw me anywhere and I could figure things out now, but it sucks. I mean, that's just the nicest way that I can put it. You are so like, okay, so now you're like, well, okay, so I'll use this random person who I kind of know's address and they'll add me to their lease maybe, and that's how I can get something else. I mean, you really sometimes have to finagle how you can get that first rental contract, or you can also, if you need to, maybe live with a local. So you're sharing an apartment, and because they're local, their name can go on the lease, and that's how you get your name on your first lease. But you'll have to get your name on a lease. You'll have to get bills in your name with that address on it. Phone bill is probably the easiest way, but sometimes that counts, sometimes that doesn't count. Utilities obviously are another more stable showing of your address. But you will find that landlords don't necessarily want to rent to you because you're the foreigner and you're the flight risk. So you might have to pay 2 months deposit, for example, because they think that you're a flight risk, or you might have to show your work contract. And so in order to show your work contract, you might have to first like get a phone and pay a utility bill. I mean, it can be very, very confusing. I'm not saying that to scare you. You're going to figure it out. People move abroad, but essentially the process goes, you move abroad, you're going to live there. Maybe you get a job now. You're going to do a year-long rental. You will need to show things with your address on it. You will need to show pay stubs, just like here. But because you are a foreigner, you will have to either pay more deposit. Your rent might be higher. You might have to have someone co-sign, like a guarantor, which can be hard because you're an expat. And you might not know a lot of people there, but those are usually the more difficult things about it. Rent is usually the highest cost when you live in Europe. So your food can be really relatively cheap. I mean, sometimes beer is less expensive than water. I mean, as somebody who lived in Germany, I can confirm, and I'm sure in France, wine is cheaper than water. They actually have a law in Germany that like something has to be cheaper than the beer, just because otherwise everyone would get beer. It's just funny, but so your cost of living can be relatively low, and your rent is usually probably 50% of your expenditures.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. What about so in order to pay rent, you have to have a local bank account to that specific country, or do you transfer money? How does that work logistically?
So these are all the more difficult parts of living abroad, these details. So banking. I do not pretend to be an expert, and I would definitely not only trust my advice on this, but I'll tell it to you like this. Getting a bank account is also difficult. And you probably need to have either a work contract, not just the visa, but like the work contract, and or have that like non-lucrative visa. You can open a bank account abroad, but banks don't love working with Americans. Canadians have a different story here, so you can definitely feel happier that you're Canadian. Because the minute an American opens a bank account at any bank in the whole world, the American government has the right to investigate you, freeze your assets, and whatever for not paying your taxes or whatever they want to, whatever happens, right? So because they can freeze your assets, the bank essentially says, because we have just given an American a bank account, we now open ourselves up to the American government to do things within our banking system. You can still get a checking and probably a basic savings account, but when it comes to more income or different types of income, Americans tend to have to kind of still maintain two lives. If you have a lot of investments, for example, or you kind of, have a lot of, maybe you have different properties in the US and you have income streams that way, you're going to probably keep some US bank accounts. Unfortunately, it's really hard to just really pull up and live in another country as an American. In that country that you're living in, you'll probably get a basic checking and a basic savings account. It will be more difficult to get a credit card. Luckily in Europe, people don't rely on credit cards to the same level. You'll get for sure, whatever the country, however they call it, a debit card essentially. And you'll be able to use your debit card, but you will be dealing in a lot more cash. In the US, I mean, I live off my credit card. I don't even use cash. I don't even use a debit card ever. But in Europe, you'll find that you will really be living off of cash or a debit card for the most part. And transferring money can be very expensive. And you'll start to have to learn how to deal with your money. Your income in the country that you live in will probably stay in the local account, and transferring money back and forth, you have to really plan it out and understand the payment and the fees between your two banks, because sending international wire transfers costs a lot of money to do. And I understand why there's so many restrictions. I mean, like money laundering, duh. But for the average person, it makes it really hard to move money internationally. It's very difficult. In fact, there was a time, and I didn't even make that much money as an expat, but there was a time when I literally thought to myself, like, how much money can I bring in cash in my suitcase? $9,999. Maybe I'll just do that, because I could not figure out an easier way to not lose money on the transfers. I never did that, but it felt like a baller move at the time.
Awesome.
It's hard. I'm not going to lie. It's hard. Your banking is very difficult, and there are financial advisors that can help you with that stuff if you are well off enough to really worry about that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah, that's great advice. So you touched a little bit on this, old Uncle Sam for us Americans. How do taxes work? Let's just say, let's start with, I'm a digital nomad. How do those taxes work? Are you paying, and I have a visa to work in a country in Europe, but I make my own money. How does that work?
Yeah. Well, that's actually a little bit different. So if you're an entrepreneur and you make your own money, you're going to pay income tax in the country where you're a resident. Okay. But you always, and believe me, please also talk to a tax expert, about this. But this is the basics. So if you're an entrepreneur, you're gonna pay your income tax where you're a resident, and you're not a resident of the US. You're a resident where you have a visa. However, you're going to pay whatever rate they have, but you also, no matter what, have to file in the US. You don't have to pay in the US, but you have to file. And if you don't file, you're gonna get hit with some consequences. Also, though, you're paying income tax in the country where you live, but as an entrepreneur, you probably also have to pay the self-employment tax in the US.
Okay.
And you have to pay your Social Security in the US. So you're still going to have to probably make some payments, but there are treaties in place, especially in Europe, that limit your double taxation. So unless you earn, I think it's at about 134 now. So if you make $134,000 a year or less, you only pay income tax in the country where you live. Now, if you make $280,000, that difference, that $150,000 difference, you're actually probably paying income tax in both countries. However, there are also treaties that limit where you can get out, essentially, of paying income tax also on that upper tier as well. Right. So think of it this way, like, odds are you're not paying double income tax, but you do have to pay Social Security. You do have to pay self-employment tax. And here's some other things about income. For example, and this is so ridiculous, the US, as a US citizen and a citizen of Eritrea, you are the only two countries in the world that are taxed based on your citizenship and not your residency. We are the only developed nation that has to pay just because we're American, no matter where we go. So it's really annoying. On April 15th, all your friends in the whole world are just enjoying a spring day, and you're worrying about your taxes, no matter where you live. And it's super annoying. And this might be relevant to your audience. If you buy a home in Europe and you sell that home, because it's in Europe, it doesn't move, it's there. you still have to pay capital gains tax to the US government. So that's just the way it is. Like, you're not getting out of it. So you do have to pay those. So there are, depending on the other types of income that you have, you do have to pay those taxes in the US. When it comes to taxes, I can highly recommend working with a service, but it has to be a service that understands expat life, because there are different consequences for different types of jobs and work. So if you have a work visa, it's a little bit different than if you're an entrepreneur, like we were saying, because you don't pay that self-employment tax.
So talk a little bit about that. Say you have a work visa and you're working in the country. How does that work different from
So there are, and this is where I would well, let me put it like this. If you're like me, where you had a job like a teacher or something like that, where you're not working within a corporation that moved you to the country, right? Like an international corporation. It's just, you pay income tax in the country that you live in. You do not pay income tax, but you have to file at home, and you have to pay your social security tax as well in the US. You file every year. I would still recommend using a service because it's just a little bit too confusing. Unless you like love that stuff, just pay someone. I think I paid about $600 a year, and it just, that's the cost of being American. The end of story. Now, where it gets very confusing, but you have to know a little bit less yourself, is if your company moves you, if you work for an international corporation, things get very murky around if they're sending you as an expat versus if they're sending you as a local employee. It's very confusing, and it's how they do it. And so I don't really feel comfortable talking about this, but you will incur different types of taxes and different types of experiences. Like if they send you as a local employee, you might get paid a lot less. Like if you become a local employee in Malaysia, for example, your income, they're paying you, you're probably taking like a huge hit to your income, but you might not be subject to certain taxes, or the company might not be. Whereas if they send you as an expat, it might be hugely more expensive for the company. So, but the good news is that if you move with your company, they do handle that for you and break it down and explain it for you. And when you are a self-initiated expat, you have to figure everything out on your own.
Right. Okay. So there is some benefit to that, right? Yeah. Okay. Healthcare. We've touched on it a few times. Let's talk about healthcare in general. How to get it, what you need, and costs associated with it.
Yeah. And also the Canadians will feel different. So I'm talking to the Americans when I speak of the relief involved.
Well, yeah.
So first of all, before you move abroad, I would really recommend seeing all of your doctors. I say this in the book, but if you're a woman, you do not want your first intercultural medical experience to be at the OB/GYN. Like, you do not want to go to the gynecologist for the first time abroad and have to deal with that, right? So just see all your doctors, make sure you're healthy if you can. Even the dentist, like, it's weird to have someone in a foreign language, like, looking in your mouth. So just get all of your, if you can, before you go, just go to all your doctors, get all your checkups. I'll get all your medicine for several months in advance. Just get it so you have it, because you just never know. So I always recommend that. Now, when you move abroad and you're going to have residency in Europe, you will always have to get private insurance. So your private insurance might cost you $200 a month, $250 a month. If you're a woman, it's always double. Even if you're like past the chance of getting pregnant, your insurance is more money. You can get family plans if you have a family, but you'll usually always have to get private insurance. It will run you $250, maybe cheaper. There are competitive companies out there for private insurance. But in order to get the visa, you'll have to get insurance first. And that's hard, like, especially if it's in another language and they're not really, you would expect them to be fluent in English, but then you can't expect them because, you moved abroad. So why should they speak English? And it can just, dealing with insurance companies can be one of those things where it's just like, oh my God, this feels so hard. Even in the UK where they speak English, like, they use different words for everything that matters. And so you're just like, what's happening? But so I'm just saying that it will feel frustrating, but just know that once you get that insurance, you're covered in Europe, right? Like, you're not hit with the same surprises that you are in the US. So for example, you may, as a privately insured person, have to pay the costs of the medical bills upfront. So that happened to me a couple of times where I actually had to scramble. I was 23 years old. I remember this one bill in particular. I owed 1,500 euros. And I didn't realize that. So I had to scramble at that time to find that money. But then I got all 1,500 euros back. So I had to pay the medical bill, but then the insurance company paid me the whole thing back. Sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes you send the bill that they give you to the insurance company and they pay you back, but you are usually reimbursed for almost all of your medical costs. The other side of that is, unless it's a very serious injury or a very serious medical payment, it's also just not as expensive. There's not a $40 aspirin pill, for example, over there. And so even if you do have to pay up front, you're never going to be hit, almost never, with like a $40,000 bill out of nowhere.
Right.
So while you might be fighting the insurance companies in some way, you do not have to be smarter than the insurance company that's trying to trick you like you do here. It's a really different feeling. And I will say that probably one of the biggest things that kept me abroad for 15 whole years was to not have to deal with American insurance companies, because it is so much easier there than it is here. Okay. Really. Yeah. I went to the doctor once in Germany on a Sunday morning. The doctor had to come in for me because they were closed. I had like the norovirus thing, and they just let me go, and I paid no money. Wow. Like nothing. That was it. So it's crazy.
There you go. So a lot of people have asked, as far as, do they need citizenship to get the healthcare within the country outside of private insurance? Is there any way to get the actual insurance within the country?
So that depends on the country. Each country's different, but yeah, you either need to have leave to remain, meaning like you are a resident. You have to have like what I would equate to like a green card here. Okay. Right? Like you have to really have a long-term visa. You could, if you're studying at a university, and university students are included in the national healthcare, you might be able to qualify that way. But you know what? And so no, I mean, basically you have to be a citizen, long-term resident, or a student. But honestly, sometimes the privately insured do get a little bit quicker coverage or treatment anyway. I mean, you'll never sit in a hospital, obviously, and not get treated. But I just mean, it's really not that bad to have to pay for the health insurance. You don't need to be on the system. You really don't.
Right. Well, that's good to know, because I think a lot of Americans, especially with our healthcare system, it's a scary thing, right? You expect what happens in the US to happen abroad, when that's actually not the case. So the word private healthcare isn't as a big scary thing, and going to cost you a lot of money.
No, it just means that it's not free. You do have to pay for insurance. You do pay a monthly cost, but it's like more like car insurance than it is like our health insurance, right? You pay up front, and then in return you get things paid for when things break on the body.
Totally get it. Right. So we've talked a little bit about banking. Are there any like hidden costs that you found as when you moved abroad? You're like, wow, I have to pay for this, or wow, this is kind of crazy.
Yeah, so many.
Yeah.
I mean, here's the thing, like
I know I read in your book, like when you went to Germany, you got an apartment, you're like, there's no kitchen.
Oh yeah, I wasn't even thinking about that. Yeah, you can't know that. You can't know that in Germany they take the whole kitchen with them when they leave, like the sink and the fridge. You can't know that. And then I get there and I'm like, oh, I love it, but where's the sink? Like I had to buy a whole kitchen. And you really did read my books. That's like
popular abroad, right?
Yeah, right. Because they're just like, I need to get it right now. No, there's a ton of hidden costs. So another piece of advice in terms of how much does it cost to move abroad is you should have like a good pot of money that is really just for unexpected expenses related to your life abroad. And so, whether that for you is $1,000 or $3,000 or $4,000, I just like to put it out there because, so for example, even things that you don't expect, like you might need to get everything translated, even if you like got it translated in the US because you knew you were moving to France. But then when you get there, they're like, now it has to be translated by a French company and notarized. And that could be like $300 or something that you just like weren't planning on spending. When it comes to, like I was saying, with renting the apartment, you might get hit with this, like, oh, you have to pay 2 months deposit because you're a foreigner. You can't know that because you could have asked in 30 expat groups and they all said, no, it's 1 month. Right. But then like you found an apartment that you like and the landlord, that's the deal. You have to pay 2 months. Like you just don't know. I would say a lot of the time it's related to mistakes that you're going to make. You are moving to a new place with a new system where really everything works just a little bit differently. Especially in Europe, it's like it's similar, a lot of stuff, but it's just a little bit differently. And you're going to make mistakes. And you're not going to expect them. And so you're going to need that extra cash to like make up for those mistakes, or even just things like you're apartment hunting and you thought Paris was much more walkable, but actually you're taking Ubers because you're exhausted and for some reason they're super expensive and you just spend $200 on Ubers for your apartment hunt. But keep a pot of money for just go easy on yourself. You're gonna make 9 million mistakes. That is part of moving abroad. Also character building. But you're going to make mistakes all the time. And sometimes those are financial mistakes or things that you couldn't predict. Or maybe, for example, with the health insurance, like, yeah, maybe it's $200 a month, but maybe the country that you move to requires you to pay the entire month up front, like homeowners insurance, right? And so now you got to pay the whole year, but you weren't expecting that. If you have that pot of money, that's like $2,400, but you're good for the year, maybe you can just pay that like that. But there are you just don't know until you really dig into the details of the country that you're moving to on the
Awesome. So there.
Yeah.
There were a couple questions. Oops, it froze. There were a couple questions that I got about moving with animals. Any tips or advice on moving with puppy? I actually have this question too, because I'm not going anywhere without my little doggy.
Yeah. No, I mean, look, so there's different things. So first of all, you can move with your pet. You can bring your pet. There's always going to be some difficulties with your pet, but it really just depends. So for example, you can most likely, if you can fly with your pet on board, especially if you're arriving on a tourist visa, like you could probably just bring your pet and nobody's paying attention. If you have like an iguana or some kind of exotic animal, then you need to hire a relocation service, which there are many relocation services for your pets. Here's the other thing. Some people like to leave their dog, let's just say dogs. Some people like to leave their dogs at home until they get their lives figured out. It's sad and we can't be with our pets, but just like, how can you go apartment hunting when you have to go let the dog out every few hours, right? So it can, especially if you're, moving abroad by yourself, it can feel like really hard. So they'll leave their dogs at home. And then there are actual like pet relocation services that will go get your dog, put your dog on a plane, be there on the other side and bring your dog to you.
Okay.
And when you hire a service like that, they'll also fill out all the necessary paperwork. Most likely, whether you bring your dog with you or you hire a service, the minute you arrive in the country and you have a visa that's going to let you stay, you just have to register your pet, figure out all that paperwork in another language, because that's definitely not in English, and register your pet. And most likely that's all that it takes. You might have to pay a fee, whatever, but you can definitely move abroad with your pet. And I would probably venture a guess to say that lots of people don't even do that all correctly. Right. I mean, I'm not saying to skip the rules. I'm just saying like it probably, but also just make sure like when you're booking your flight to move to Europe, like just make sure the airline allows you to bring a pet internationally. Like there are also going to be restrictions there. So just book a pet friendly airline. Get comfortable with the fact that if you have a bigger dog, it's going to go under the plane. It's yucky, but they don't have like pet airlines and like that's all you can do. And you just have to say like, okay, it's just this one time and then we're living there and that's it. But yeah, you can bring your pet. There are services that will fill out. There's always a service that you can pay for, always. And if you don't want to pay for it, just make sure the airline that you choose is pet friendly and figure out before you go if there's paperwork to register your pet. Yeah. But even the UK, which used to have really strict pet immigration rules because it was an island, has really loosened up on that.
Oh, okay, interesting. Because I thought they still did like a 30-day quarantine or something like that.
They don't. You don't have to be without your pet.
Yay! That's awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. So moving on to bigger things. Moving with kids. What's your take on moving abroad with kids and the experience with it? And I know there's kind of challenges, but I think the benefits outweigh the challenges. But can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I will. So I now have a kid, and I never lived abroad with a child before, and now I have a little baby, and I can't wait to move abroad with him again. Please do not let having kids be the thing that deters you. Trust me when I say that kids take to living abroad much more quickly than you will. They will become more fluent in the language much sooner than you and be making fun of you before you know it. And the next thing you know, you're the immigrant parent who can't speak the language. That's definitely true. But also, you have some decisions to make. So obviously, before you move abroad, you'll have to, let your kids' school know and let them know you're moving abroad. Also, please, before you move abroad, plan up to 60 days in advance. Start getting like goodbye parties on the list, because your kids are going to want to see as many of their friends as they can. And you're going to want to make sure that you've really planned that out. It can be something that you easily forget when you're dealing with like visas and health insurance and apartments and plane tickets and moving your pet and moving your kids and selling your house and all that stuff. It can feel like a lot, but please remember that the personal relationship part of your move abroad is really important. And so plan in some goodbye parties for everyone. It is so possible to move abroad with kids. Once you move abroad, you'll have to figure out daycare situations or school situations. And with daycare, it's probably a little bit easier. You can just pay for a private daycare at first, but then they also have like free preschool and things like that in most countries in Europe. And when it comes to school, you can either decide to throw your kids in the deep end, and as long as you have a visa that allows for them to go to public school and be a part of the public school system, you can just throw them in. I mean, up to what your family decides. There are also international schools that have a very high level of academic achievement, and there are American schools abroad. That's usually in the larger cities, but for the American, or honestly, just international diplomats, like lots of international diplomats, even if they're from Singapore, Japan, Malaysia, they send their kids also to American high schools. And they do this because then they're part of like an American education system, and they're more likely to be able to go to college in the US. That's a very usual path for like a Singaporean diplomat's child, for example, or something like that. So there are American schools abroad. And oftentimes that's where teachers transfer and work at American abroad. So you can, but those are expensive. I mean, they can be like 30 grand a year. So, you just have to decide what kind of a school you want to put your kid into and how integrated you want them to be right away. And there are also homeschooling options where you can on a US schedule, but that just really takes up a lot of your time as an expat, like rather than being out exploring. Now you're homeschooling. So, but you can definitely do it. And I would say, I mean, what an amazing experience for your kids. No matter what their age, you're opening up their world like you could have never imagined when you were a kid. And so I would definitely recommend it. And always remember, there are other expats. There are other expats with their kids there. You immediately can integrate into the culture and society much more easily because you have this excuse. Like you have a kid, you have to go to the local library because you need something to do. But when you're, without kids, you might never go to the local library. The only thing I will say is get used to, not only did you deal with everyone's opinions about how you raise your kid at home, but now get used to all these Europeans who have different opinions on how to raise kids. It's different. The culture clashes that you'll experience, whether they're good or like, whoa, are different. So you'll really have to pick up on the different parenting styles and cultures of living abroad. Also a great way to integrate and learn the culture, but it can definitely be like, whoa. But there are things like playing outside that kids might just do. Like, they can ride their bikes in a different way. You don't have to worry about school shootings. I mean, there are many benefits to living a life in Europe. And I don't say that lightly. I say it really seriously, but kids do play outside a little bit more and feel a lot safer within their school environment. That's for sure.
That's awesome. Cool. Well, thank you for that. I'm coming up to the last couple of questions. I know someone asked, and we've talked about this before too. Do you need to know the local language? If you're moving to Europe and I don't speak French, is that going to be a problem?
Yeah, I mean, French is a great example because the French, just everyone knows that the French speak French and only French, but that's also not true. So do you need to learn the language? No, I would not let not speaking the language stop you from going. But I would absolutely say that before you go, you should try and figure out some basics. It's only going to make your life easier and cheaper because you don't have to pay for everything to be translated all the time. Right. But also, one thing I really recommend if you're moving to a country that is, a language that you're totally unfamiliar with, and you have the time and luxury to do this, do like a 2-week immersion course, right? so just go to a language school for 2 weeks, learn the basics. That will completely improve your game. And while you're dealing with all this kind of gross paperwork, visas, insurance, all that stuff, you kind of have someone with you. You know, you're not just there to learn like dog and cat. You can also be like, what does this say? Is this what am I understanding this correctly? So you kind of have like your own team built in when you land. But no matter what you do, if you're going to move abroad, please learn the language once you get there. It will completely alter your experience and give you a depth of experience that you can't have. And if you don't learn the language, being friends with anyone but expats becomes really difficult, because in social situations, you know, if you're at a party or something and everybody's talking, you know, speaking the local language, and then you rock up, sure, they can speak English, but they don't want to. And they didn't come to this party to practice their English. So no, it is not a barrier. Move abroad, move anywhere you want to. Live out in the world. But when you decide on the country that you want to move to, yeah, you should definitely learn it while you're there.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. So one last question, and I know that you moved as a single woman abroad. What are some safety things to consider as a single woman moving abroad?
Sure. Number one is that the majority of people I met on the road and expats were single women. So don't think that it's not safe or that women aren't the ones moving abroad, because of all the like the backpackers I met, for example. Do you know how many were single, and single older, not exactly karate, you know, choppers out there? Like, you can do it. You do not have to worry. Of course, you need to be safe. But when it comes to like specific amounts of safety, what do you do here? You know, how do you pay attention and protect yourself here? The same is there. The things I will say are this: especially when you first move abroad, you're going to feel open, right, to the whole world, like elated. You know, in the book, I refer to it as the honeymoon phase, but your like energy is open. You're like ready to take things on. Please be careful. And I mean, obviously don't talk to strangers, right? But that's not true. When you move abroad, you're going to talk to strangers. It's the deal, because like everyone's a stranger. So you're going to feel really happy. You've always got to temper that, unfortunately, with the fact that like, am I safe? But I bring that up because you can be like, everyone's so nice here and everything's so great. And you can, it's like a drug. Like, you feel great at first, right? And so, you know, things can catch you off guard. Also, because you don't understand things, people can convince you maybe that this is the way it is, and you might get taken advantage of, for example. So even something basic like paying too much for your drinks or whatever. And there's always, I mean, in Latin America, I call them gringo prices, but like there's always foreigner prices. That's some of those hidden costs. You always pay more than you're supposed to, because then the locals do. When I lived in the UK, I didn't realize that I was like shopping at the Whole Foods equivalent as a student, because I loved the store. I was like, it's a great store. And everyone's like, you don't have to shop there. You can shop at the cheaper store. And I was like, oh yeah, it's a lot cheaper. So those are the hidden costs. But no, just be really smart. You're going to feel really elated. So make sure that you keep yourself safe. Obviously, you know, don't drink late into the night by yourself with people that you don't trust because you're so excited to be there. But otherwise, you know, I think that the US is like kind of one of the scariest places I've ever traveled or lived, you know? And so I think we're already trained. In fact, one thing I would say is, don't let the US mindset of being wary of everyone actually keep you from meeting more people, because you will find that people abroad can actually be much more open, even than we are, because they're not so afraid like we are. And so it's a real catch-22, because you could actually be more open in some circumstances and talk to strangers all the time.
Yep. Great. Yeah. Awesome. Anything else that you wanted to touch base on, or kind of share with our viewers?
Just go. Okay. No, look, not everybody thinks about moving abroad, right? And so if you are one of the people that is thinking about it, like maybe it is a calling for you. Maybe it is something that you should follow. Also, you're not crazy. One of the things I hear from like clients who work with me is, and I actually start the book this way, like literally I start the book this way, like, you're not crazy. People around you right now, they don't live abroad. So they don't know what they're talking about.
Yep.
They're going to think all the scary things, and they love you, so they want to protect you. But, you know, anyone you're around right now isn't an expat, and they don't live abroad. So when you find that your team, that's why it's so important, you'll realize like, whoa, there's lots of people doing this, and this is totally possible for me. But if you are dreaming about this, believe me, there are millions of people right now who are not. So like, just go, start it, do it. You won't regret it.
Again, special thanks to Jessica for sharing her expertise with us all. It was a fun conversation. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to find Jessica, you can go to @JessicaV.Drucker on Instagram, or you can go to jessicadrucker.com on the internet. Go find her book. You can find it on Amazon, or you can find it directly at her website as well. So go give her a shout. If you enjoyed this, please share this interview and Armchair Expat with your friends. I would love that. If you want to follow along and subscribe, hit the bell for me, will ya? All right. Would love feedback too. You can always contact me and find me at Bargain Homes Abroad on Instagram. You can also go to www.bargain-homes.com. Talk to you soon. Bye.